Hello, and welcome to episode 26 of TBR, the To Be Read podcast, where we talk about the books we love and the topics that interest us. I'm Patrick Stemp, and with me, as always, are Michael Ronn and Jamie Maltman. How are you guys doing?
Great. How's it going, Patrick?
Good. And tonight we're going to talk about choosing which book in your huge TBR list, which to read next. And we're joined by special guest Amy Schubert. How are you?
Hello.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, would you want to introduce yourself a little bit to the viewers and maybe talk a little bit about what you write?
Sure. So I'm a reader first. I kind of thought being a writer for most of my life. I actually have a blog. I write about creative work and having an online presence at my site, Lemon and Raspberry, and then I've just started writing fiction in the last year or so, and my site for that is atschubert.com. And I write primarily literary fiction, and literary fiction with like little offshoots. So I have a rough draft called George Washington Serial Killer, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's literary fiction with kind of like a crime and history edge. And I'm working on a series that takes place in Engine World, the same world as The Dream Engine by Sean Platt and Johnny B. Truitt. And I would call that like literary fiction with a veil of fantasy over it.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I hear you've been involved in some sort of anthology that we've never talked about before.
Anthology, you say? Yes, and I also I have a master's degree in literature, and I am a developmental editor. So when the anthology Beyond the Gate came up, Eric Pierce asked me if I would be interested in developmentally editing all the stories. And it was a lot of work, and it was so much fun. And it was over the summer, and I have a hammock in the backyard, so I took my laptop out to the hammock, and I just read fiction and told people how to make it better. And it was amazing. It was the most fun thing ever. Developmental editing is maybe the best job for a reader. It might be my dream job. It's fantastic.
Well, that's good. And there were, 23 or 24 stories in that?
I lost count.
And one of them is your own, of course, right?
One of them was my own, and it was very, very short, so that barely counts as a story or as editing it. But then there were others that were very, very long. The last story, in fact, actually took me 10 full hours to edit, which is kind of a lot for a short story. So I would say that I worked on it from about the beginning of August through the beginning of October.
Cool. And you mentioned Eric Pierce. It's interesting to see, like I said, there's like 23 or 24 authors in there, and I was just actually listening to him on Matt Brotherton's podcast, the New Writer podcast, and that was fun too.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about the books we've been reading over the last week. So any volunteers to go first, or should I go from left to right on the bottom of my screen?
Left to right.
Left to right?
Is fine, which usually means me.
Actually, no, that means Amy this time.
Wow.
So how's your week?
I have visual aid.
Okay.
I
That's
just
a first.
finished. Wait, are any of you guys Middle Eastern or Jewish?
No.
No.
Okay, so you will not know if I'm mispronouncing this. I just finished The Golem and the Jinni. It was for a book club that I'm part of. This is a debut author, published 2013. It is historical fiction, 19th century New York City immigrant story with Middle Eastern mysticism. So the Golem is a Jewish supernatural kind of figure that you might recognize from X-Files or Grimm or some other TV shows. And the Jinni is basically like a genie. He is a figure of fire, and both of them end up finding themselves in New York City without masters. Or the Golem doesn't have a master, and the Jinni does have a master, which is the opposite of their normal, of the way that they're supposed to be. So it's, I really, really liked it a lot.
So you finished it?
I finished it this morning, yeah.
Okay. That's, I think, because I know I had that one on my TBR list, and we'll talk about that more when we get to our topic, but I can't remember if it's still on there or not. I haven't read it yet, and I'm not sure if it's still on my TBR list or if it got culled.
Well, I hadn't even heard of it before it was picked for my book club.
I think it was a Goodreads Award winner last year.
Was it?
Or it was on the list, if not a winner. So
That may be how
Second
it ended
one.
up on my TBR list. I can't remember.
I liked it a lot. But if you don't like 19th century historical fiction, then you won't like it.
Oh,
It's
don't
just-
have to try.
There's not enough supernatural in it to call it really a fantasy, I think. But I love literary fiction and 19th century stuff, so I liked it a lot. And then the other thing that I'm actually halfway through is The First Tycoon, which is a biography of Cornelius Vanderbilt by T.J. Stiles. And this is a book that I read American history for fun because I'm trying to teach myself everything that there is to know about American history. So I'm at roughly the middle of the 1800s. So Cornelius Vanderbilt is there. So I just picked a biography literally at random. Like, oh, that one is big. That looks good. But it's actually fascinating as part of the economic history of the United States. So if you're going to learn about the economic history of the United States, it starts with Alexander Hamilton, and then it goes to Cornelius Vanderbilt. He was like the first big self-made businessman in America. And I like it so far. Did you know that he started a, what's it called, a steamboat and train crossing of Nicaragua during the gold rush? Who knew?
I didn't know
He
that.
started Vanderbilt University. You know?
Yeah, that's all I knew.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. So I'm enjoying that a lot.
Cool.
Awesome.
And that brings us to Jamie.
all right. Well, I finished the one I had started the previous week, which was The White Prisoner by Ognian Georgiev or Georgiev, or I'm not exactly sure because I don't speak Bulgarian. But it was about that one about the weightlifter who Olympic weightlifter, and it was basically like the two converging stories of like his life, his upbringing, getting into weightlifting, and him being stuck in a Brazilian prison and getting out of that, and a little bit about what happened there. So really, really interesting, and I like to read some sports biography stuff once in a while, and so read it, and overall thought it was good, and learned a ton about. It was interesting seeing that window into just before the fall of this, like the Eastern Bloc, Soviet, end of the Cold War, and how that impacted the sports aspects, but also life aspects a little bit. So it wasn't a focus, but I find that kind of stuff interesting, so enjoyed that. And again, the author, he's a sports reporter in Bulgaria, so definitely knows his stuff, did all his research on that side. So that was The White Prisoner. And then I just finished reading a book that I beta read. You mentioned Eric Pierce, actually. I beta read something that he's written as the next episode of his story from Beyond the Gate. So he's working on that. I'm not sure what the release date will be, but got in on a little bit more steampunkish stuff. And his is definitely more steampunk than most of the story, or not most, but at least half of them in the stories in Beyond the Gate. And like that a lot. And I also read an editing book it was an indie author that I knew from another group or something like that wrote an editing book that's really focused on sort of if it was like your first editing book for indie authors, that would be a good one for people, especially if they haven't, if they've gotten back into writing maybe 10, 15 years after finishing any kind of formal schooling, and they don't remember a lot of those things, or never really internalized some of the different rules or some of the different things that they should be doing. So that one is called Polish Your Prose, and there's a subtitle to it, but it's by Harmony Kent. And
That one is more about like the mechanics and punctuation and that kind of thing.
There's two halves to it. One was more copy editing type points, and then the other one was more proofreading type points. And actually there were three parts. There's another following part about reviews and how you should think about reviews, and so just a little bit about that side of things for an indie author, and even about writing reviews as well, and as an author and just in general. So it would be a good book to give a proofreader too, actually, if you had some people that, or some of your beta readers maybe. So from that perspective, but I thought it did a really good job as that specific space. So sort of that first book for indie authors to read, and I actually did recommend it to a few of the people that Amy might know that would and actually like the recommendation. So that's awesome.
That Amy might know.
Yeah. No, it's just some people that had said, this is, because some of the authors we had in the anthology were writing for the first time, or writing for publication for the first time, and so they wish they had more of a grounding in their copy editing for themselves, and So I thought it was good. And the other sort of feature in there that could be of interest to people is she has a whole bunch. She's in Britain, Harmony Kent, that wrote it, and so she's got a section on British versus U.S. sort of terms and just some of the little things that would be there. And I learned a bunch that, because I knew most of them because I watch a lot of British TV and I've read different stuff, but there were a bunch there that I was reading to my wife saying, wow, I never would have believed it. And there's a few that are actually the opposite. Like they actually mean exactly the opposite thing between the U.S. and the U.K. in English.
Oh, weird.
So. And we're in the middle, like in Canada. We sometimes take one, sometimes take the other. So
You're always neutral, you Canadians.
Oh, and then I just started, and I'll mention it probably a little bit again when we go into our TBR piles, Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. So that's one that I've read the first few chapters. I don't know that I'll be able to finish it before it's due back at the library. So, but it's got color magic this time. 'Cause he's Mr. Magic Systems. He loves to develop all sorts of really neat magic systems, and this one's about color and breaths. Like each person has a breath, and if you collect enough breaths into you, you're more powerful with the magic. But if you all the color becomes more vibrant, so there's just some interesting stuff there. But you can't take a breath from someone; it has to be given willingly. And so there's these kind of god kings that get people to willingly donate their breaths to them and stuff. And so I don't know. It looks interesting. I don't like it as much as the previous one of his that I read, The Emperor's Soul, but we'll see if I'll get a bit more of a chance because I've got another week.
That kind of reminds me a little bit, for some reason, of that. Was it a Jet Li movie? I think it was called The One, where there's like all this multiverse, and he finds a way to kind of travel to the multiverse, and every version of himself that he kills, he gets more powerful. So the movie kind of takes place as they get to kind of like the last two Jet Lis. One of them has no idea what's going on. He's been getting more and more powerful as time goes by, and with no knowledge of why. And then this other Jet Li shows up, and it's pretty cool. The other, and you mentioned Brandon Sanderson. Do you guys listen to the podcast he's on, the Writing Excuses?
Absolutely, yes.
Fantastic podcast. Yeah, I just started listening to that one recently. The most recent one was great.
Yeah.
So that takes us to Michael.
Yeah, I got a lot of reading done this week, actually.
Show off.
Because of the Thanksgiving holiday. Yeah, I read like 10 books, but I won't go into all of them. But yeah, I got a lot of reading done. But I guess the three that I finished that were most significant. I'm looking at my phone here. I'm not ignoring you guys. But the first one was Virtual Freedom by Chris Ducker. You guys heard of that?
I haven't.
He's like an online entrepreneur, internet marketer guy, and it's basically a book on virtual assistants. It's like the go-to book on working with a virtual assistant, hiring one, communicating with one, where to find virtual assistant, and just a core philosophy behind it. And it was interesting to me because I listened to his podcast. It's the New Business Podcast, and I like him a lot. It's interesting stuff. And so I just read that, and maybe one day, if I ever work with a virtual assistant, this book will come in handy. So it was kind of like daydreaming in my head what it would be like to have assistants, working with me, doing websites and all that stuff that I don't want to do as an indie author. But that was a good book. I would recommend that. And then the book that I read was The Battle of $9.99, how Apple, Amazon, and the Big Six publishers changed the ebook business overnight. And that's about the ebook price fixing case that happened back in 2010, where all the Big Six got together with Apple and basically colluded for the price of ebooks. And I'm sure you guys know about that. And that's kind of to the Amazon Hachette dispute. So I was interested in that because I think it was on sale for like $2, so I picked it up, and it was a pretty quick read. It was maybe 50 pages or so, but the way he wrote it was really in-depth, and it gave a great overview of the case. And I think that a lot of indies should read this because it's pretty important, and I think it's pretty telling as to where the industry is going to be going in the next few years. So that was the second book I read. And then the third book I read was a novel, and it's Ted Saves the World, the first book in the series by Brian Cohen, co-host of the Sell More Book Show, which we've talked about him in the past. It was awesome. I liked it. It was funny. It was definitely different. It had a lot of different, like I guess you could call it YA, but it had a lot of action adventure. There's like some undead fantasy things going on in it as well, and it was fun, and I enjoyed reading it. And yeah, I'd be curious to see what the audiobook sounds like on it. And it's definitely, the writing style is different than I thought. It jumps in and out of different characters, so it's a multi-POV novel, which I didn't expect, but it ended up working out pretty well. So,
is there a particular reason why you're interested in the audiobook? Like, I'm just wondering, like, if it's like, do you know who narrated it, or?
No, I know he's finished with it, and I think he's going to be giving out codes here in the next few weeks. But I just love audiobooks, especially for books that I like. You know, I mean, it just adds a different layer of dimension to them.
He mentioned it on their podcast. Like, there was the one I just listened to in the car yesterday, where people really like the voice for the narrator. Like, when he was vetting them, he saw that as feedback from other people listening to audiobooks of this narrator. So. He's really happy with it, apparently. So.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting story, like genre-wise, that I'd be curious to see what the narrator sounds like on it. It's just something you'd have to read it to know what I'm talking about. But yeah, those were the highlights of my week.
Okay.
What about you?
Yeah, I guess that brings it to me. So I finished reading The Rosie Effect by Graham Simsayan. So it's the sequel to The Rosie Project, which came out late last year, I think, late enough that I'm pretty sure it was, I can't remember if it was one of the books in the Goodreads Choice Awards or not, but so the second book is good, not as good as the first one, so I mean, I would recommend it to anyone who's already read The Rosie Project. I mean, you wouldn't want to read the second book first. It's, you know, same characters, same sort of strange things going on, this guy who's just inept, getting in trouble in different situations. It's almost like a sitcom or a rom-com, but it's good. So I mean, if you've read the first one and you enjoyed it, I would definitely recommend the second book. But it's I would kind of call it more of the same. Not necessarily a bad thing, but not quite as exciting the second time around. And then I think by Myra Grant, and it's the sequel to her Parasite. And so this is a series about a company called Symbogen that has engineered these tapeworms, and they put these tapeworms in people, and they're supposed to make them basically immune to disease. It gets rid of allergies. It's supposed to just kind of fix people, but strange things are happening, and these worms are basically turning people into. It's kind of zombies without really being zombies. They're I think they call them sleepwalkers in the series. But so book 2 picks up where book 1 left off, and just sort of more. Well, I don't know where it's going to go yet, but it's good. I really like Myra Grant, and that's my reading. So we'll move on to our topic. But I think first of all, we wanted to just do a real quick touch base on last week's episode where we were talking about the Goodreads Choice Awards, and maybe just talk about any of the winners, if any of the books we read or were favorites for ours won in their categories. And I will note that my top book of the year, The Martian, by Andy Weir, something truly amazing would have to come along to bump that down from number 1 for me. Did read in the science fiction category. Unfortunately, Andy didn't win in the debut Goodreads author category. That went to Pierce Brown for Red Rising. So I might have to check that out. I don't know. That was sort of, the science fiction is sort of my go-to category, and it's kind of nice to see my personal favorite book of the year winning for that category. So anything jump out for you guys? Yeah.
No, there's nothing I noticed. I was happy to see The Martian up there. Heard a lot of good things about it. Everything else I haven't read. So.
Jamie?
Yeah, pretty much the same. I remember sort of going, oh, okay, because even the ones that we talked about last week that I found interesting had disappeared in favor of other books for the actual winners. So that was a little bit underwhelming, I guess.
Yeah. Amy, did you have any thoughts about the Goodreads Choice Awards?
I was looking at it. I thought it interesting and disappointing that so many of the winners were sequels in the fiction. Because, I can't just pick up the sequel. I have to start at the beginning. But I did think that the mystery thriller choice was wrong. That book is not good.
Oh, no?
It's fine. It's fine. It's Stephen King.
Should have stuck with horror.
Here's my problem. It's like Stephen King's first hard-boiled detective novel, but it is not at all a hard-boiled detective novel. Like, those have a formula, and he strayed from the formula, so that's not what it is. I think that Robert Galbraith / J.K. Rowling's book should have won that category. Not the Cuckoo Calling, the Silkworm. I love that book.
Okay. Yeah,
Rainbow
you're right
Rowell's
about
book is pretty good. Landline. It's one of those books that's like, oh, it's a nice, easy read. It's not really a reread kind of book.
Mm-hmm.
But like the Diana
Gabaldon.
Thank you. That's like book 8 in the series, and the
And it's the Outlander tie-in with the show, so that's
exactly. The young adult fantasy is a sequel. The Blood of the Olympus is a sequel. So, like, I suppose I have to start at the beginning.
I guess that's what people are reading. Yeah, I was starting at the beginning. I mean, what was it? Did The Wheel of Time end? I don't think it ended. Did it end up winning the Hugo this year? Like, the series was nominated? I can't remember. There was some to-do about that. Like,
I know a lot of voters were not happy to have that as something they were supposed to read, considering it worked like the rest of the list. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Well. Okay. So we'll move
we have
on.
some comments.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
David Anson is watching. He says, "Evening all."
David. Hello.
Evening, David.
Evening.
And just refreshing, and yeah, that's the only comment.
Okay. So
I saw more than I thought I saw.
Our topic for the week is how we choose which book in our giant TBR lists to read next. So who has some thoughts on that? Who wants to go first?
I will
Amy?
go first.
Go ahead.
Because my method is probably not anything that anybody else uses.
Okay.
And first of all, there are exceptions, of course, but 9.5 times out of 10, what I do is so my library lets me keep a queue of 50 books and put what date I want them.
Wow.
So when I have a new book that I want to read, I put it on my library queue and I pick a random date in the future, literally just at random. And even when that date comes up, there might be a wait list, or they might have to request it from somebody. So I totally forget what date I put, and then all of a sudden I get an email from the library saying, "Oh, we have this book for you," and I say, "Oh, well, I guess that's what I'm reading this week." And that is how I read most of the books.
So do you do you ever find that it's something you're like, well, I thought I wanted to read it at the time, but not so much now?
The only time that has happened is when since I'm reading American history mostly in chronological order, I have had a couple times when I got a book that was not the right era. That I thought it would be this era, but it actually was more like 30 or 40 years later. So in that case, it's like, oh no, I don't want to read this yet. I don't want to skip over these 3 presidents. So that, in that case, I do. But otherwise, no, I read everything the library sends me. I mean, obviously, I tell them what books that I want to read, so I just say, okay. And then I just go by when their due date is.
That's awesome.
That keeps it simple.
Yeah.
I have almost 2,000 books on my to-be-read list for Goodreads, and that, of course, doesn't include all of the books that I want to reread, so I just read them. I just read what they give me.
That's a good simple way to keep it going. I find with my TBR list that, and this is why it grows and grows and grows. I usually find that when I finish a book, I already know what I'm going to read next, and it might be because it's the newest book that's come out that I've been waiting for 6 months. If it's typically if it's a trad, like the book I'm reading now, Symbiont, just came out last week. I've been waiting. I pre-ordered it like 3-4 months ago, I think. And other than that, I usually don't need to go to my TBR list because I keep downloading books, I keep adding new books, and so I already know what I'm going to read next based on what's on the Kindle, and so I just keep putting more. I go through my TBR list every once in a while and cull stuff to just be like, well, a year ago I thought I would read that, but I doubt I'm ever going to get to it, so I'll just...
Come on, where's your ambition?
Trying to be realistic. Well, then I figure if the book kind of gets mentioned again, or if the universe wants me to read it, I guess it'll get back on my TBR list. Like that Gollum and the Genie. I put it on my list. I don't think it's there anymore, but then hearing you talk about it, I start to think, well, maybe I want to put it back on. Maybe you were here for a reason, to get that book back on my TBR list.
You know,
It's meant to be.
I love recommending books to people, and I go out of my way to read books in multiple genres just so I can recommend books to all kinds of different people. Oh, you like this kind? Well, let me tell you about it. I'll talk books all day, every day. Now, wait, so I have a follow-up question for you, Patrick. How do you choose what of your Kindle properties that you read? So if you just downloaded like 12 Kindle books, how do you pick which one of those to read?
Sometimes it might depend on whether I'm reading for a specific purpose. Like if I'm, preparing for NaNoWriMo, I might focus for a couple weeks on reading all of the books that I got in the story bundle, right? So I'll go with the nonfiction. Fiction, these days it sometimes depends on who wrote it, because, as I get to know more and more authors through this sort of network that we have, if Kevin Tomlinson or Scott Richards published a new book tomorrow, that would be what I'd read next, because I have sort of a personal connection with them. So that is also becoming one of the ways that I pick. Outside of that, sometimes I just go through the list and grab the first one that I went, oh yeah, I wanted to read that.
So you don't choose by cover?
I might choose whether or not I want to read a book by its cover sometimes, but that doesn't determine, once it's on the list, that doesn't determine when I'm going to read it. What about you guys? Jamie, Michael?
I kind of blend, it's funny, I kind of blend both aspects of both, for sure. I can bridge that. The first one would be, is the book due back on like the third, because I can renew twice. It's like 3 weeks, then 3 weeks, then 3 weeks. So do I have a book physically out of the library that I have neglected for 7 weeks or whatever, and now it does need to go back, and I know I can't, or did I request it? Like when I had The Name of the Wind that I read last month, I had to reserve it, so I knew it was going to have to get reserved. It was going to get reserved again, so it was going to be gone. So I only had that 3 weeks. So it's like, if it's a library book that I really did want to read, it wasn't, because sometimes I'll request stuff from the library and I'm like, if I feel like it when it's here, I'll read it. But so that, so there's something like that. So like that Warbreaker that I'm reading now, it has to go back next week. So I'm like, well, I'm going to give this a try now, and then if I like it enough, I'll at least mark my page and get it out again if I need to. But so that's sort of number one, top of the list. The second one would be sort of what you were saying. If I've made some kind of a commitment to someone, or I know it would be helpful to someone to read it sooner, then I will. So like so if like, then this is usually people that I know, that I've met, or that I've connected to, or just that I followed that author a little bit online. Because if you can read it soon after it comes out, then that's those extra reviews are going to be helpful to them at that point. So I'll do that. And another sort of permutation of that would be if I would like to talk to someone about it. So some of the times where you guys read some of these, like Green Star, I was like, what, I'm going to pick that up. It sounds like, and if it fits in as well, like it sounds like it's going to be fun. You guys have already been talking about it, then I can talk about it with you guys a bit. So I'm funny that way with book clubs. I know Amy's definitely involved in book clubs, and I joined a few of the Goodreads book clubs in fantasy and sci-fi, but I use them as another way to add books to my TBR list, but I sort of have this strong dislike for people telling me you should read this book now. Like, if I opt into reading it now because it's going to help you, no problem. But if it's like the moderators of the book club online are saying, thou shalt read this book this month, I just get my back up and don't want to do that.
I don't think you understand book clubs.
Yeah, well, it depends on the book club, right? They have different rules. So.
I was going to say you were...
I may not. That's a good point. So
you could start it on like the 10th day of the month instead of the 1st and really stick it to them.
I'll say this. You just reminded me. I noticed, Amy, I was going to mention, because we've all been kind of sending Goodreads friend requests back and forth. And so when I was comparing, I'll take recommendations from you all day, I think, because, you can compare books.
Uh-huh.
I think our little Venn diagram was probably pretty darn close to being a complete circle. I
don't actually read hardly any sci-fi, so that is shocking to me.
But I think we may be reading a lot of a lot of the same nonfiction.
Oh yeah.
And maybe a lot of the same SPP like the books that the SPP. So but that was just interesting. I was like, holy cow, it's like 90% similar or something like that.
So funny.
Little side note there.
Because I know I usually get like 10, 12 books with most people that I sort of randomly check that on. If people I just bump into on Goodreads.
I mean, it is helpful
yeah.
that there's like 500 or 600 on my read list to compare to.
Yeah, that's a lot of books to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
I've got all
in the library.
That's 3 or 4 years worth plus books that I know that I own, that I know that I've read, but I can't remember when. So, yeah, it's kind of a big pool to choose from.
Yeah, I've got almost 500 on my read list. I'll hit 500 next year easy. But yeah, I did the same thing with Goodreads when I got it. It was like the books that I knew I had read because I've been tracking it for a couple years specifically. But then, yeah, I put in all the Stephen Kings because I know I read all of those back in the day and all of the, whatever else.
It's always so discouraging to me when I'm like, how can I not have marked that as read? I'm sure that I read that. Well, I better do it right now so Goodreads knows that I liked it.
Well, yeah, and then maybe you'll get some good recommendations from that.
Exactly. Like there was another 19th century Jewish immigrant novel that The Golem and the Jinni reminded me of, and so I looked it up on Goodreads, and I had not yet rated it. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and I think I put a couple books on my read list that I knew I didn't like, so that it wouldn't recommend anything similar.
That's smart, actually.
Right?
Just 1 star all the books in the category.
And you know what? But I kind of wonder if some people do. It's kind of like, so I did the same thing with Netflix. This may be a good way of explaining it. The kids would come over and watch, I don't know, some kids show or whatever, and then I've got all this garbage in my feed, and so I would go onto the website and 1 star every kids show that I could find, so that it would stop recommending that stuff. And it works.
It's like karate kicking a waterfall, right?
Yeah, and I'm not, and you're not doing it to be mean. This is why I tend to rate and not review so much on places like
Nickelodeon's going to send a hitman to your house.
Give it as much knowledge as I can so that it will give me good recommendations, because that's really what it's for, right?
Yeah.
I was going to say Nickelodeon's going to send a hitman to your house now.
Yeah.
Who is this guy? Come on.
I once started all the Caillou. Get that crap off my feed.
All right, that's fine. That approved.
Yeah. Well, I used to have a rating system, and it was so convoluted that I just couldn't do it anymore.
Like one that you did for yourself? Like
I would do it myself. Like how I would pick what to read next. So
did it involve like index cards and like a wall chart?
Dungeons and Dragons dice and like.
No. I actually had like a little workflow chart, like of what I would read next. So like, I like to read fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and graphic novels. Right. So I would just basically say, okay, I'm going to read a novel now, and when I read a novel, I would alternate. So I would read a novel like way back when, like say Robert Louis Stevenson or Charles Dickens. I'd read an old novel, and then I'd have to read something contemporary. Like I would make myself read something contemporary as a result, and then I would make myself read something indie, and then I'd make myself go back and read something, classic, and then I'd jump into poetry and I'd do the same thing, old, new, and then I'd cycle all the way through. But then every third book it had to be a reread. I had to reread something that I'd already read before because
Michael, you are out of control.
It was completely out of control, and like it lasted. I did it for like a year though.
Do you know?
And then I was gonna say, and then ebooks and print, that messed me up even more because then what do I do?
I think this is the perfect opportunity for you to hire a virtual assistant to manage your to-be-read workflow.
I've always wanted Goodreads to have like a little feature, like on your to-read page, like a little button, like a blinking button, like pick a random book on my shelf for me to read. Because sometimes I just can't decide. It's like if it's a print book, you can do like eeny, meeny, miny, mo on your bookshelf, but like. How do you pick what to read on your?
You could do that yourself. I mean, if you've got 183 books or whatever, just get a random number generator or something to pick from.
Yeah, I used to do that.
Random.org.
Yeah, I need something to tell me that though, because that's too much work.
Well, you want me to go through your list and tell you what to read?
Only if I don't have to pay.
Michael's list.
and to kind of, I think what you're talking about, normal people would do kind of I think we kind of do that naturally. So, like, Amy, you were asking this, you pick by cover and that kind of thing. But I think some of us might also pick what genre or what kind of book we want to read, also maybe based on what we just have read, or maybe how we're feeling. Like, I may not feel like reading some literary, I've been reading Don Quixote for I think 2 years now, and I just need to get through it. And you might so after reading, what's that?
You don't actually need to get through it. You could just.
I want to.
Cliff notes, man. It's taking you 2 years.
But you might like reading something funny, so you pick up. You're sick of reading the literary stuff, and so you want to just read something for laughs, or. So I do. So like I said, normal people kind of do the same thing, but just based maybe on gut feeling rather than dice and spreadsheets, I guess. Yeah.
One of the things I used to always try to do, though, is I used to try to ignore that feeling, because I felt like I mean seriously though, when I would.
You are adorable. Go on.
When I would read books, I would just want to find something new. So like if I just finished literary fiction, maybe I do want to read something hard-boiled, because it's going to make me stretch and grow as a writer. So like I would try to make myself jump out of that, and I think that's why the system for me got broken, is because I just couldn't
so
keep it up.
So here's a question for you guys, especially since like we're all writing. Because I think we all and Amy, maybe you haven't weighed in because you haven't been on the show before, but I think the three of us would agree that we are writers who read, right? Like I don't subscribe to the idea that you can't read other people's work because God forbid it should influence your own. You guys would agree with that, I think. They're shaking their heads if there's any audio listeners.
Yeah.
Or nodding, rather. But do you read in the genre that you're writing, or do you prefer to read outside of the genre you're reading? Like, do you do any of that when you're picking what to read?
I read really fast. I read really, really fast. So, like, I could pick a book and read it in 2 days and still have 7 weeks of writing my book. So, yes, I read in the same genre, but that doesn't mean that it's going to influence the whole thing. So, like, for example, I read Etiquette and Espionage in the beginning of September, and that's a book I read in like 2 or 3 days. It's young adult, it's fast-paced, it's really good, and it kind of influenced what I decided I wanted to write in the Dream Engine world. And so when I went to Austin, I'm like, okay guys, I got this idea, and I kind of told them an idea, and it was kind of influenced by Etiquette and Espionage, but now that my first draft is done, it's barely the same. But it was totally influenced by Etiquette and Espionage, just in the general idea, not in anything else.
That's cool. You guys?
Yeah. It just depends. Like, for me, if I feel like I did a lot of reading before I became a writer, so I don't want to say like I'm just going to coast on all the books that I read, but if I'm writing in a genre that I don't know how to write in, like thrillers, for example, recently, then I'm probably going to read a lot of thrillers, but I tend to be like a literary sojourner. Like, I don't stay in one place for very long. So, I might read poetry for like a week, and the next thing I'm reading some weird literary fiction, and then I'm reading some nonfiction about cats or something. I mean, I just, there's no rhyme or reason to what I do.
Well, and I was just flipping through my list too as we're kind of talking, and it occurred to me that one of the things that might influence what I want to read next on my list would be something that's been recommended. So the book that kind of jumped out to me here was, Michael, you've mentioned a couple times, like The Physics of the Future.
Yeah.
Which is one that, you've mentioned it a couple times, you really enjoyed it. It sounds like something that I would enjoy, so I would be more likely to read that sooner rather than later, because I want to talk with you about it while it's still fresh in your mind, not 3 years from now when you're like, I don't remember reading that.
That's a good point.
I was going to say, to your question there, it's funny, this is something that's changed since I became a writer, and I think a lot of fantasy readers tend to go to a series. It's like, read the first book of the series, I like it, read the whole thing, if it exists, right? Or read everything up to, and then some people won't even start a series until it's finished for that reason, unless it's Game of Thrones, just because then so many people were talking about it that they started it anyway. But I don't do that anymore, and I think part of that is I don't want to like that. I think if I kept reading book after book after book by an author, that's the one way that might start to influence me a little bit more. Whereas if I'm reading one book and then even something else fantasy, but something different, and I just keep changing it up, I feel like then if there's any influence there, it's not going to be recognizable, and that's all that matters. Like there will be influences there sort of by osmosis, but as long as I'm not so deep in that world, it's not going to be a problem. So that's why I've tended to read, like, I know when I was writing my first book, I read a lot of first books of fantasy series to just sort of see how they kick things off. And then when I was starting the second book, I did go back and read a couple of second books from some of those. So I've done some of that targeted reading, like you were saying there.
I find I think I have to, and I haven't, so I think I almost have to finish a series, because if I don't, I find that I'm not going back to them. So, like, I read the first in Edward Robinson's Breakers series. Loved the first book, but then kind of moved on to something else. And now I think, God, he's up to like book 7 or something. But they're still sitting there. I just haven't made it back to them. Same with Unicorn Western. I read the first 2 books and then moved away and read something else. And those books are now just kind of sitting there, languishing on my list, waiting to be read. And I find it's kind of hard to go back, because I think maybe if it's not. Because I've already read the first 2, it's not like so I know the world, and I guess I'm always looking maybe for something new. And so they sit there. I'll go back to them someday. I intend to go back, but we'll see if I ever do.
I think I will go into a wave of some of those before too long, actually, of starting to revisit some of these series that I had read before. And that's another thing, like you were saying with what's on the Kindle. There's certain ones that I will go and I'll look and I'll see that it's been there for a while, and I remember that one. I'm like, oh, that one is getting me interested again. I should put that there. And I actually keep it's funny because Goodreads doesn't have a list. It's got just a list of all the books that you've added to be read. It doesn't have any ranking system that, like, I want to make this be the next one, or some kind of queue that's in there. So I do that actually in a Google Keep little thing on my phone. So that's where, when I think of a book and I'm like, okay, I'm going to want to read this soon, I've got a bunch of bullet points in there of either authors or specific books that I either need to read for some reason, or I thought, I want to read that sometime soon once I've cleared off those things that I need to read for some reason.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's the main place I keep my sort of next reads section.
You could kind of do that through bookshelf, like add some bookshelves, read next. But then if you're doing it in Goodreads, you might start using that as your TBR list almost, and that would grow. So yeah, that's interesting. That would be something that would be nice for them to add, so you could, like you said, almost rank them in the order you want to read them. If Goodreads is listening, and I'm sure they are, they should do that.
and fix everything else on the platform where you're at, especially the user experience. Just say it.
Yeah, it's not bad, but there are definitely some problems.
And the mobile app. Fix the mobile app, please.
Yeah, especially for
that's kind of what I was thinking about when I said problems. Yeah, the mobile is not great.
It's really good for certain things, but if you get involved in groups, it's horrible. Like the going over from email to the group stuff is a disaster.
Yeah, and it does. Yeah, I don't want to.
Anyway, we love you, Goodreads. You're great.
I love Goodreads, but like anything else, it could be better. And if they can email us at tbrpodcast@gmail.com if they want some more feedback. I'll let you know if we hear from them.
Oh, I did have one more thing that in terms of managing my to-be-read pile, and that's because I'm the one of us that does read big epic fantasy books. Mm-hmm. I don't read them back to back. Like if I'm reading, like after I read the second book of Game of Thrones, I went and read a bunch of short stuff after that because I'm not going to dive into another 1,000-page book at this point because I just feel it feels so slow. Like it feels bad enough if you can't get anything finished because you're reading multiple things, but when it's one book that's taking you 3 months, it just feels incredibly slow to me now.
I'd be interested.
Game of Thrones was the opposite. I wanted to read all of them one after the other, so I didn't forget any of the details.
That's a good point.
And so, Jamie, I was going to ask, have either of you, Jamie, I know you haven't, but read the Tough Voyaging series of short stories by George R.R. Martin? I'd be curious to talk to somebody who's read both, like Game of Thrones, the epic fantasy, and then his science fiction from years ago, just to get a take on how much he's evolved as a writer. And because I'm never going to read Game of Thrones, but I don't know anybody who's read both. So any last minute comments? I think we're kind of winding down here. We're at 9:45. Any
I have
last
one.
thought? Go ahead.
This is not really self-promotion. I am hosting, somehow I found myself as the leader of a Harry Potter book club for December. So if anyone wants to read Harry Potter with us, go to Facebook and search Noveltea, Noveltea book club. And oh my gosh, so we started yesterday, and literally like 15 conversations started within 2 hours about Harry Potter, about merchandise, about the movies, about characters. It's amazing, and it is so much fun to be with that many readers who are so excited. So I would recommend it if you like Harry Potter to come join us. Yeah,
I think I saw that pop up in my feed. So what are you doing there? Are you trying to read all 7 books in December? It kind
of just started like, I only want to read Harry Potter when it's cold out. So I actually put off my library books for a month and a half because I'm like, I'm going to reread Harry Potter. And I mentioned to a friend, and they're like, oh, I want to do it too. And I mentioned to another friend, and they're like, let's start a Facebook group. So my friend who runs the book club, she didn't want to pick a book for December, so she's like, Amy, why don't you just lead it for the month? We'll do Harry Potter. It'll be casual. We'll assume everyone's read it. So I was supposed to be the leader, but like I don't have to do anything because everyone is so excited to just talk about it. And we just assume that everyone's read it or seen the movies, so we don't have to worry about spoilers. And it's really just a mutual love fest is what it is. Monica Lionel is doing it with us.
Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I recommend it if you like Harry Potter because everyone is so happy to be there. And that just makes it fun.
I haven't read the books yet.
Oh my gosh! So when we were in Austin...
Oh, shame on you.
I was meaning to wait and start and read them to my son, and that'd be my first time actually reading them. And I haven't seen the movies in a long time. I specifically, once we were getting closer to having kids, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna hold off on the rest of the movies until I can watch them with them down the road. But yeah.
I'll come clean too. I've read the first 2. I haven't.
I'll read one this month.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, you guys!
I haven't read the whole series.
So I went to Austin for the World Building Summit with the self-publishing podcast guys, and so we're talking about story, we're talking about the world, we're talking about like characters, and obviously everyone's read Harry Potter, so you say like, oh, like such and such character, oh, like such and such character. Dave Wright has not read the books or seen the movies. He's like, no spoilers, guys, and I almost punched him.
That's a big shocker.
Right? He's like, no, I'm gonna do it. I forget what his excuse. But the first book came out like 17 years ago, so if you haven't read it by now, you're not allowed to be mad about spoilers.
I mean, there's children in jeopardy in every book. I mean, you can't get
right?
everyone to
That's
read
what
it.
the whole series is about. The most jeopardy for one child that could ever occur.
Ever.
Anyway.
He reads mostly nonfiction, I think.
Boring.
Yeah. So, Amy, where's the best place for people to find you online if they want to come looking?
I am on most social media as Amy T Schubert. Schubert is Schubert. So Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest. And my writing website is atschubert.com.
And you also have Lemon and Raspberry?
And lemonandraspberry.com, which is mostly for crafty blogging ladies. So probably the 3 of you guys will not be interested, but maybe some of your listeners will.
I hope so.
Great.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. It was great having you.
Yeah, thanks.
It was a good talk. And speaking of listeners, we'd love to hear from you. You can send us an email at tbrpodcast@gmail.com. We'll be awaiting the email from Goodreads. If you have a question or if you'd like to suggest a topic for the podcast, if you're an avid reader and you'd like to talk about joining us for an episode to talk books, you can let us know. We record live Tuesdays at 9 o'clock Eastern, but we can always be flexible with that based on time zones. You can subscribe on YouTube or iTunes, and if you'd like to leave a rating or a review, that would be fantastic. And be sure to visit our Goodreads page, which should be in the link to the show. And thanks for coming out. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, thank you.
You guys have a good week.
Happy reading, everyone.